Hey there, everyone. I'm Julie Galano, and welcome to GME Compass. And welcome back to another one of our Let's Talk series. Today, we are extremely excited to welcome Cynthia Gomez as one of our guest presenters with us for today's series.
Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here to have a conversation about what GME is. I am a GME leader and I have been in GME for 16 years. I started out as a program coordinator with not any knowledge at all of what GME was or what the position entailed. So as I continue to work in the position and continue to progress in my career, I became to learn so much more of what I originally did not know. And I'm here to give a little bit of golden nuggets for everyone who's watching and part of GME Compass. I'm very excited.
It's awesome. And that's exactly what we want to create in GME Compass is those little pearls and golden nuggets and to create a space of community and learning and collaboration amongst our program managers and our program coordinators. And
Yes.
our primary topic today, which I know is a topic that's kind of very close to both of our hearts in different
Hmm.
ways, is what keeps program coordinators up at night.
Correct.
So my first question for you is what are the responsibilities in your opinion that program coordinators carry that people outside of GME rarely don't fully understand?
I kept it to a few bullet points. The
Mhm.
main one that I feel, in my opinion, is everyone knows that we have an accrediting body, the ACGME, right? Everyone understands that there's program requirements that everyone has to adhere to. We have to be in compliance with them. But what people outside of GME don't understand is that it's up to the coordinator with input, right, and leading from the program director is the interpretation of those requirements. Not only the interpretation, but also the implementation of those requirements. So in my 16-year career, I have been able to help others interpret what those requirements are. A requirement that might seem the same for one specialty is completely the same for another. And two different programs, two different specialties, they will implement those requirements differently because of this specialty, because of the demographics of where that program is at, and because of the resources that they have available. So that's something that coordinators are a part of that looking from the outside in, people don't understand. They feel, oh, it's just doing schedules and making sure the residents graduate. No, it's so much more than that.
Excellent. And that's something that directly you'll hear from the ACGME. I was extremely fortunate to have a very close relationship with our executive director of the ACGME when I worked in OBGYN and still stay in touch with her. But one of the things that she so often says is that ACGME doesn't want to overly control
Hmm.
and get too specific because once you get too rigid, then programs are kind of backed against the wall because of exactly your point. ACGME doesn't just want to dish out
Mm-mm,
citations. They don't
mm-mm.
want to just put programs on probation. They really truly do want to set you up for success. And they recognize that a very small rural community hospital
Mhm,
is going to have completely different resources, faculty, opportunities for education, access to support than a
mhm.
large academic medical center, and then everything that falls in between those two things.
Correct. You're so right. The ACGME, like you said, does not, they don't want to control, they don't want to prescribe what your program needs because they want to give some level of autonomy to those programs to create a program in Atlanta is going to look different than a program in Arkansas because two different demographic areas, two different regions of the country. They don't want to prescribe. When I became a coordinator, one of the mistakes that was done with me was I was told that the ACGME were horrible. Well, when I met the ACGME, because as a new coordinator, I didn't know, I couldn't ask anyone, so I went to the source. What does this mean? And they basically said, we give the requirement so you can meet it to the best of your ability. And that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for cookie cutter. Different people, different residents, different programs. They want something that meets the standard for education, but not that is prescribed for every program.
I feel like I have a different epiphany or revelation every time I have a blood clock where I'm like, I always knew this, but it didn't quite click.
Hmm.
And then once we start talking, but as you say exactly your point and what you're saying, from the same notion, why would you want the ACGME to prescribe a cookie
Hmm.
cutter program across the country or within their overseeing bodies? Because the patients aren't the same. The patient
Correct.
population isn't the same. The hospital systems aren't the same. They're so different. So you want to have a dynamic opportunity for curriculum. You want to have diversity in your programs, diversity in your training, so that as you're going different places, you are bringing exactly as we're talking here about GME Compass with us as program coordinators, as the trainees, you're bringing these pearls from these different places to where you go, whether at, once you becoming an attending physician. If it
Hmm.
was all
Hmm.
cookie cutter, we would just be a robotic system.
Correct, correct. Another point to that same question, you wrote down that so we got the interpretation and the implementation of the requirements, but and then maintaining those records to meet compliance. So yes, it's all done, but do we have documentation to prove it? And sometimes it could be many, many different reasons why documentation isn't fully kept the way that it could be. Now, that could be, again, for many different reasons, but I feel that sometimes people from the outside don't understand. It's just not doing a thing, it's proving that you're doing the thing. But in addition to that, it's proving that you're doing the thing well.
Yes. Yeah.
Hmm.
What is the requirement? What are you doing? What are your outcomes? And your outcomes are never they're not going to always be perfect. You're going to have wins, losses, and
Hmm.
everything in between. So what are you then doing in response to that?
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Another point is monitoring your data and making sure that your data is accurate. It goes along with that documentation. Data as simple as, when is orientation date as opposed to when does training start? What are the dates on a contract? That has to be maintained accurately because, for example, for contracts that could set off just a rainstorm of things if that data is not maintained accurately. And what people don't understand is that there's coordinators sitting there or people in that have oversight over that, sitting there making sure it's the same there, it's the same there, and it's the same there. That's very tedious. That's very time consuming. Yes, everyone can be very detail oriented, but that still requires eyes to go in different areas to make sure that all the documentation meets the requirements set forth by the ACGME.
And that's a great example because it sounds like a small superficial example to from the
Mhm,
outside looking in, right? But when I think to my program, much like many others, their contract dates when they start for their
mhm.
orientation is not the same as their clinical start
No.
date. So
Mm-mm.
that means that their contract date is not the same as their training licenses. So
Right.
then when you think about it, if you're just looking at it, because we are trained, I always liken our jobs to fashion. We are trained to work one season ahead of what's
Right.
happening, right? So
Mhm,
our
mhm,
brain is always a season ahead of wherever we are, and probably arguably two.
mhm,
And when you think about it, the trainee comes and is gone and they
mhm,
come back. I still have residents and fellows texting me for questions, they're getting a new job,
mhm.
whatever. But if you don't know their faculty, the residents, the graduates, in this example, the graduates, our program director, it can be very confusing when you're completing a federal student loan forgiveness program that's going to go
Yes.
by your contract dates because that's
Mhm.
your date that you were employed by the
Right.
hospital versus an education verification of training where you're talking about what is their clinical experience, and those are different and mean different things versus what was your start date,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. That is so, so important because program coordinators and managers are the keeper of everything. They
Yeah.
keep everything. Everything, it's under their purview. So it's a heavy load, but it's a load that you do today and you still have benefits of it later on. For example, the graduate that comes back for verification, you know. When
Yeah.
I was a coordinator, I saw verification from people who who graduated residency in the 60s.
Yeah.
Where the heck am I going to find this? Thankfully, records were kept accurate.
Yeah. We were the oldest OB program in the country.
Mm.
So exactly, we would have verifications that come across. I'm like, this is before I was even born.
Bored.
Where when I was first starting, I was like, where does this
Mhm,
even
mhm,
start? Like
mhm.
what?
Exactly.
And trying
Mhm.
to figure, so that is a great, so what do you think are some examples of something we had just said, the start date versus your clinical start date, but things that can be small issues or challenges or problems that can snowball and escalate very quickly in training programs?
There's just such a long list, but the
So
ones
many.
from so
Yeah.
many, because and one thing that I wanna let the coordinators know is everything could be caught early if you're maintaining accurate documentation, right? The first thing on my list was PC burnout. Yes, we're all busy. We all have to do certain things, but making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. I would recommend, everyone knows the academic calendar. Everyone knows when recruitment season, when we're interviewing, when onboarding, when orientation, everyone knows all that. At least take some time off. Schedule it in your calendar for the year. We do didactics for the year. We do PECs for the year. We do CCCs for the year. We know all of that. If a coordinator does not take care of themselves, it can snowball into something worse. And I know that my body personally, when I am too stressed or tired, my body shuts down. That can happen to other people. So you know
Mhm.
yourselves, you know your body. The other thing is, I think a lot of our audience is going to agree with this, missing evaluations. We know evaluations is a requirement. So those evaluations should be matched early on into the academic year. What I would do personally as a coordinator, and when I became a director of GME, all my coordinators had their evaluations matched before the year started. Because then you have to monitor, okay, who's not completing them? Now, if you're not on top of checking out who's not completing them and you're waiting 6 months, CCC is coming up, I got to pull the documents. Well, there's nothing there because you never checked it back in July. You never checked it back in August.
I would get so frustrated in my program because my program director refused to do the schedule 12 months at a time.
Oh.
And she refused because,
Mhm,
you have to have everybody and I would say like that doesn't operationally work.
mhm,
And so she would do it 6 months at a time, but then what would happen was I was always a stickler for exactly what you were saying. I learned that very early on in my career, and when I started in family medicine decades ago, and it worked, right? You roll them
mhm,
out, and yes, if a block switches or somebody has a swap or somebody does, yes, you have to duplicate work and make switches,
mhm,
but
mhm,
that is still better because you can look at it at a time where you can block your schedule, you're not distracted, you're focusing on one, creating the schedules, and then two, matching those evaluations and the people, so that then as the academic year goes, you can focus on those really important details, like you said, of
mhm.
staying on top of your evaluations, sending reminders,
Yes.
sending tire texts if you have to, because then what would happen was every year I would literally end up in tears because I was falling on deaf ears, because
Mhm,
when was I then building each block schedule? We would hand put the assignment half day schedule in for all 26 residents. I would have to put that in,
mhm.
then match the evaluations. I was doing that during interviews.
Oh,
Because that's
wow.
what, right? Because she wouldn't get it
Mhm,
done until
mhm.
October, almost November, and now I have to do it. I'm scrambling in the height of interviews, and guess who's working up until Christmas Eve to get things put
Wow.
because
Mhm,
the holiday break's coming up, and I just got the call schedule, and January 1st is in a week, right?
mhm.
that is something that, while my situation, it was not in my control, if you have any control in it, that's a game change. That changes
Yes.
the way that you
Mhm.
operate throughout the year, because that's one of those things that are interwoven in every,
Everything.
and
Exactly.
you can have so much more attention to detail if that skeleton of your evaluations, your block schedule, your call schedule, if that is done, you can then focus on the details.
Mhm, mhm. One of the things that I would tell, whatever program director I was training or any GME leader, as part of my training of them, I would always mention the rotation schedule is what runs everything. We have to
Mhm.
have a rotation schedule early on because of that schedule, that's evaluation matches, didactics,
Exactly.
finances. Some people tie, they use new innovations and tie the iris report into that. Everything runs on that schedule.
Your
So for
curriculum mapping.
exactly that as well,
Mhm.
like I said, the evaluation. So if program coordinators or managers have enough, and pull, I say, start waving and saying, hey, this needs to get done, this needs to get done, and convey the urgency that everything pulls from the block schedule, the rotation schedule. It'll be helpful for them in the long run. The other
That's a good
thing
one.
along the same lines are duty hour violations. Duty hour violations is something else that can snowball. If you're, first of all, if you're not monitoring duty hours, that's a violation of the ACGME requirements, because duty hour violations are supposed to be discussed in the GMEC meeting. Okay. The second thing is, if you're not monitoring duty hour violations, then you don't know if a faculty member is not being professional. Because if a resident or several residents go over their duty hours for that one rotation, that faculty member needs to have a discussion. The program needs to have a discussion with them. What's going on that your residents on this rotation are always going over? They might have to be pulled. I've had programs that no, we're pulling this faculty member, we're stopping that rotation until we get someone else or until we figure something out. That can snowball into something even worse because no one's putting eyes on the duty hours. No one's exploring, investigating why is there now it could be an input error by the resident. It could be that the resident is a PGY1 and they just don't know. They did it wrong. Okay. But
And that's
that could
right
be,
and easy.
that's fine. Just
Yep.
re-educate. That's okay. But you wouldn't know that if you're not monitoring your
And
duty hours.
your duty hours and how your duty hours feeds into, you had mentioned GMEC, your
Yes.
PEC, your annual
Right.
program evaluation, it really does tell a story about your culture and your
Yes.
program and what it looks like. And our program, it was the citations and the duty hours. We had 24-hour calls, which is very much like the culture in OB.
Mm,
We had 24-hour calls, and it was our duty hour violations and documenting them,
mm,
keeping good documentation of them,
yes.
follow up, responses to the follow up,
Yes.
and that was what gave us the leverage to make the systems change, because it's a domino effect. It's like
Mm-hmm.
pulling the string on a feather. One thing that you think is just the situation affects so many other things. But
Right.
that was how we had the leverage to go from 24-hour call to 12-hour call.
Wow.
And that was huge.
Mm-hmm.
And our faculty, our department, our team, our clinical teams, one, that was a culture change, but two, it was a massive culture change,
Mm-hmm.
but then two, our residents didn't at the time, they love it, right? But at the time, what they saw on paper was my golden weekends, or I'm going to be working
Yes.
more days instead
Mm-hmm.
of less day. When you're looking at calendar and when you're working 80 hours on average, which might mean more, that that really is a game changer. That can be deflating. But that was our data that we were able to use to say, this is a need and this is a safety issue. This is a patient safety issue. This is a trainee safety issue. And this is why now, in hindsight, everyone loves it and it's become a culture of the program. But
Mm-hmm.
it was exactly what you're saying, all of that documentation that got us to be able to make that massive change.
And that's a great example of why documentation is so important. It's not to keep a record of every bad thing to report someone. No, it's to affect change, to impact change at a massive scale, just like your example proved. That's why documentation is so, so, so very important. And if it's not handled in the upfront portion of whatever issue, it will snowball out of
Yeah.
control. It will definitely. And the other thing that can snowball out of control, and this is with faculty, with residents, with institutional leadership, with facility leadership, communication breakdowns. If the fact that there was a communication breakdown, communication breakdowns can impact patient care, it can impact resident education and training, it can impact so many different things. But if it's not addressed early on, it can snowball and become a nightmare. So
Yes.
I encourage our audience, when you see a hint, and it doesn't have to be not drama filled, you know, it's just, hey, you mentioned this way. Did you mean what I took it as? Just a clarifying conversation to avoid misunderstanding and misinterpretation, and definitely that communication breakdown.
Even if it's not your intention,
Hmm.
whatever the background, but I always say someone else's perception is their
Yeah,
reality, right?
correct.
So
Yes.
even if that's not how you meant it, if that's the way that it was received or
Hmm.
having that conversation can quash something so early on that can become
Yes,
so much bigger.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So what would you say, in your opinion, is an example of your version of a GME nightmare?
So many. One thing there's certain things that we can control, and there's certain things that we can't control. For example, when I was a coordinator in New York, there was a major storm. A major storm. It was Hurricane Sandy, and I had interviews that day.
Oh, I
And
remember that.
the day before, I had to call all the applicants and say, where are you right now? Some were flying in, some were canceled, some were in New York. Okay, everyone stays where they're at. We don't know what's going to happen. That was nature. I couldn't do anything about that. The only thing I could do was start speaking to the program director. Okay, what other day are we going to offer to these applicants, because it's not their fault that they can't come and interview with us, right?
Mhm.
That's something major. But another one that I have been, this is my own experience, right? A resident that in their PGY 3 year um, is unable to graduate because they didn't meet their procedure numbers. That's avoidable, because that goes back to the data accuracy. If you were looking at the procedure logs, you could have seen in their PGY1 that they weren't getting the numbers that they needed to get. And that could have been avoided. It turns into a nightmare, because what do you do now? Now you have this person who's in tears, right? They have to carry a level of that responsibility as well. But now, how do we fix this? It can turn into a nightmare very, very badly. The
And
other one that I've been in an personal experience is, everyone looks at numbers, surveys are great. Oh my gosh, surveys are good. The evaluations are great, feedback, blah, 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 all this. But then come to find out that even though the numbers are good, the hidden culture is horrible. I'm sure you have examples of this, Julie.
yes, I
Where
do.
everything looks okay on the upfront and no one does anything because all the numbers look okay. But deep down, there's a horrible culture. There's toxicity, there's abuse, there's unprofessionalism, but you can't tell that because all the numbers are okay.
Yes.
That's where those missing evaluations come in. Everything is connected in GME. If the
Yep.
culture is bad and everyone is encouraged to provide feedback, in an evaluation, it could have been caught then if someone wrote it down.
And that so it's interesting. And that culture can be so multifaceted. It can be a particular service,
Mhm.
right? Like
Right. Right.
we think in OB it's always gynonc is
Right.
trusted.
Right.
Always it
Wow.
doesn't matter. But, it can be a particular service and
Mhm.
that's the culture of the service, not saying it's right at all by
Right.
any
Right.
means, but
Right.
that's the culture of the service pervasively. It can be the culture within the faculty and the system, not even the training environment, like the faculty's burnout of the system. I talk a lot
Mhm.
about the business of medicine and what that does. It can be the culture in the recognition and empowerment and respect and inclusion of your program coordinator, your
Yes.
education
Mhm.
coordinator, your medical student coordinator. Because if you don't have trust and psychological safety in your support team, you've got
Correct.
nothing. It can be any one of those systems
Mhm.
things, but exactly what you're saying is kind of that the hidden facade. And as you start to really dig into things, like it looks good if you take a real fast at a glance, but if you start really taking a deep dive and putting these different puzzle pieces together, it's like, wait a minute, these aren't meeting quite right.
Right.
Something is off.
Mhm, mhm. I wanna empower our audience. Ask the questions. You're not being, combative, confrontational. Just ask the questions because and we'll talk about this and we've already mentioned the coordinator is the keeper of everything, right? So just ask the right questions because a lead on to what I just said about the culture problem, the big nightmare is when the residents go straight to the ACGME and no one in the facility knows anything that they just reported. That's just horrible, right? On so many different levels. But not that we want to discourage our residents to going to the ACGME because that's their right to do that. But ask the question, why did you go to the ACGME and didn't report it to us? Why
Yeah.
didn't you say something? They can say, well, we did, but nobody listened. Or they can say, well, I didn't know I could do that.
Or even like we always tell them, to exactly your point, the ACGME is always an
Hmm.
option. Our ask is to utilize these other resources because these
Correct.
resources are in place. That is if you feel like none of these things are feasible options for you. You're falling on deaf ears, you're beating your head against a wall, or it's a massive emergency. But it obviously you always want them to come to us. But even to just take that one step further, if you didn't feel comfortable coming to us, why didn't you go to your resident liaison? Or why
Yes.
didn't you go to
Yes.
HR? Or why didn't you go to your division of education? Like to me, that says
Mhm.
systemic issue that there was
Yes.
no one or nowhere
Right.
that you felt
Mhm.
like you could go.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it becomes a nightmare because now everything stops. At least from the corporate level I was in, everything stops. Now we have to investigate. And now who is the first person that I went to? The coordinator. Okay, this was said. What documentation do you have? Right? That, again, documentation is important. And it just shifts everything. It just shifts everything because now we have to answer to the ACGME and they're very gracious. They said, hey, we got this complaint. You have 48 hours or something to respond. Okay, stop everything. Let's explore. And in that exploration, you start digging and finding other things that no one knew was occurring. So with the coordinators and managers is you're not being a tattletale. You're maintaining compliance. And maintaining compliance is you don't have to you're not the program director, that's not your responsibility, but you are the administrator of the program. And as administrator, you should know what's going on over here, what's going on, not deep. Certain areas, yes. Others, you don't have just know that it's going on to avoid the nightmare that
Yep,
these things can turn into.
because they can. They can. I
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Cynthia. I can't tell you how honored and how thankful I am that you reached out to us and that I've gotten to know you.
Thank you so much, Julie. It was great. It was a lot of fun. I look forward to continuing the conversation and
Yeah,
let's talk.
that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see everyone soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.